Su primer trabajo en la industria del videojuego fue en Origin Systems en 1987, portando el juego de 2400 AD del Apple II a la Commodore 64. En 1989 entra a la compañía Softace, que sería el trampolín para la creación de id Software. Trabajó ahí en esa compañía que él creó de 1991 a 1996, creando juegos como Commander Keen, Wolfenstein 3D, Doom 2, Hell on Earth y Quake. En total ha fundado a lo largo de su vida 8 compañías de videojuegos, y dentro de las cuales se encuentran id Software, Storm, Monkey Stone Games, Casino Entertainment, and Loot Drop, de la cual es el CEO actualmente. Y sin más tardanza, les presento al señor Alfonso Juan Romero.
Thank you very much. Thanks for inviting me down to Mexico. Believe it or not, this is the first time I've actually been far into Mexico, out of the border, like Nogales. And I'm really excited to tell you guys about why Apple has such a huge impact on gaming. Everybody here knows about Apple's iPhones and iPads and the power that they've risen to in the last, I guess since 1997 when Steve Jobs came back. With the introduction of the iPad mini, you're going to see a lot more people playing games that compete directly with Nintendo and Xbox and Sony. So what I want to talk about is kind of the historical perspective of Apple and how the game industry kind of got started, and kind of give you guys some quotes from some notable figures in the game industry about what the Apple meant to them. The Apple II, I'm going to specifically talk about, which was the Apple computer's first real computer that brought them into the mainstream. Let's see. So it all starts back in the 70s, even though it started a little further back than that. In the 70s, pinball machines were kind of they'd been at their height a little bit earlier and were starting to wane a little due to the introduction of Pong and other games like Space Invaders in 1978. But the arcade is where I spent a ton of my time before video games actually appeared. And so I used to go into these places that were, dark rooms filled with lit up pinball machines, and there was nothing else in there but maybe some food and stuff. But everybody was playing pinball machines, and then one day these electromechanical machines appeared, and they were basically in an arcade cabinet like these arcade cabinets, but inside of the actual box was a physical thing, like a rotating scene, and they have dune buggies or something else that you would steer while the thing rotated, and that was why the physical space of an arcade machine is the size that it is now, because of the electromechanical machines. And then video games happened right at the end of the 70s, and that's when I really started to get excited about games, because it wasn't just rolling a ball around, it was digital, and it was really interesting, it had color. So I spent a lot of my time in the arcades, and that's what really influenced a lot of people back then. At the turn of the decade, I guess, from the 70s to the 80s. The Apple II is foundational to the game industry because of its role in basically translating a lot of these arcade games into the home, and then creating other kinds of games from those original arcade games. They influenced a lot of genres. So, let me go back to that. you know, when the Apple II first came out, it was hailed as a really great business machine with the introduction of VisiCalc. And also, you could word process on it with, you know Apple Writer and AppleWorks. And people use the computer a lot for that, but, you know, people can't do that all day long, otherwise it would be kind of boring. But, you know, other programs came out, utilities were there, mouse paint was great, because then you could actually use a mouse and draw and kind of be creative on the computer as a user. But really it was all about the games on the Apple II. Like, the things that people traded were games back then. They basically did a lot of buying of games, pirating of games. There was a huge community of people that traded this stuff because games were so exciting. And these are just, you know, a few of some of the biggest games that were out on the Apple II. I don't know if anybody here even remembers any of these games. Has anyone here played any of these? You played them? Do you all understand my English? It's maybe too fast. But some of these games, there's wizardry at the top left, which kind of introduced RPGs to people that were not just playing D&D on paper, but, you know, could do it on a computer. And the Ultima series was also an RPG series that took a different kind of perspective, but gave another aspect to how you can play an RPG on a computer. Lode Runner was kind of a morph of Pac-Man with a little bit different objective. It's Aztec, you know, it's like Indiana Jones going through dungeons. Dino Eggs, which was just really a very different game. That it was a platformer, but it wasn't like any normal platformer, so you could see the evolution of like the platformer genre into something different, which is really what was interesting about computers, because you could quickly take a game in a genre and you can kind of evolve it quickly and get it out there versus having to make hardware into an arcade machine and try and get it out in arcades. There's Karateka. You guys didn't know that's how you're supposed to pronounce it, Civ Karateka. Jordan Mechner actually told me that because everybody said Karateka all the time. Karateka is also being released on Xbox right now. Jordan just redid Karateka. And it has pretty cool in its latest form. Then there's Zorro down at the bottom left, another platformer. There's Bolo, which was one of the first games to use the A-star algorithm for pathing. And then there's Thief, which was like Berserk in the arcades. And so a lot of the early games on the Apple II took what was out in the arcades and either copied them directly or they evolved them. And so the earliest part of the computer game industry was really taking what was in the arcades and trying to just copy those things, and then they quickly evolved into their own thing, and people stopped copying the arcades. So, just to give some dates on the Apple II and its place in history, the Apple II was released months before the Atari 2600, if you guys remember that. The Apple II was released 2 years before the Atari 800, which was another home computer. It was released 4 years before the IBM PC was ever out. And 4 years was a long time in the computer industry back then. It was released 5 years before the Commodore 64, which became one of the biggest selling computers for games, you know, back in the 80s. But the Apple II was there 5 years earlier to actually create the foundation of the game industry for people that basically bought the Commodore 64. So the Apple II was first before all of the popular systems that came out after it. And during that time period was when the Apple II started to kind of create the game industry. So the earliest software that you would get back then used to come in Ziploc bags, and those Ziploc bags would kind of hang on the wall, and it was basically a disk inside of a kind of cardboard folder. And so when you went into a computer store back then, you would just see a lot of hooks on the wall with a lot of Ziploc bags hanging on them, and there's nothing in the middle of the store because everything's hanging on the wall, so it's kind of empty. But that was like the first packaging method that they used before creating actual boxes for discs and stuff. And everything that was hanging on the wall, they were all Apple II games because that was the beginning of the market. There was nothing really, other than some TRS-80 games, most of everything was on the Apple II because of color and sound and everything. So some of the foundational people that created the game industry, one of them is Dan Gorlin. He created Choplifter, if you guys remember Choplifter. It was a really huge influence in the game industry, and it really didn't copy anything that was out in the arcade. So it was an important game because it did something different. And it was published by Broderbund, which back then was known to be a very high quality game company. They wouldn't release something that wasn't very smooth and tested very well and very professional. Dan Bunton is very important because of Dan's contribution to multiplayer gaming, which was huge. Speakeasy Software was the name of the company he released his first game under, which was called Wheeler Dealers, and the game came with an actual peripheral to let 4 people play on an Apple II through paddles, and then Mule was another huge game back then that on an Atari would also let 4 people play together. And so Dan Bunton made many multiplayer games back then and kind of provided the blueprint for how multiplayer games could be played over modems and then later networks and local internet networks. But yeah, Dan was very influential in the game industry. Dan actually had a son and a daughter, and the son works at EA in Redwood Shores where we live, and so he's got his second generation out there still. Jim Mitchell's, he was also kind of a hero to me because he did such a great job with his games. He had great animation, but one of the hardest things that he did was he actually made music play while the game was playing, which today sounds kind of dumb because everybody hears music playing in games, but back then on an Apple II, an Apple II doesn't have any kind of hardware to support sound. So whenever on an Apple II, to make any kind of sound, the foundational sound on the Apple II was a click, and to get a click, you had to access a memory location. So you just basically use an instruction to touch a memory location, which would then just make this go. That's it. And so you had to create tones out of that for lengths of time, and that kind of tied up the processor in loops in assembly language to try and make like any kind of music. And so if you heard any kind of music coming out of an Apple II, it was probably a frozen screen with this music playing before it would actually move forward and do something else, because the CPU needed to spend all its time just generating these buzzes, you know. And the thing that Jim did was he actually made entire games work while the speakers were playing music, and that was extremely difficult programming back then. There were no threads, you know. There was no debugging really. You know, if your program blew up, you needed to know what you just did later. You know, the last thing that you did, because that's what caused it probably. And there's no breakpoints. You know, you just watch your program blow up and guess what happened. So it was really tough back then, and to be able to do this technical achievement was really difficult. The game that's on the bottom right was called Microwave, which was like a Pac-Man, and it played the Star Wars Cantina music. Mark Trammell also was a really great programmer, and even today he works at Zynga. So if anybody's played Bubble Safari on Facebook, that's Mark Trammell's game. Mark's been in the industry since 1980, and you know, his first games were published by Serious Software. His first one was called Sneakers, which is very much like Astro Blaster. Any of you remember the arcades back then? There was a game called Astro Blaster, which was kind of a Galaga-ish type game. And then Beer Run was the other game on the right there that he made that was a platformer but did very, very different things, which is really great because he helped to evolve it. Even Sneakers was innovative for its time because the shapes on the screen were so huge. They weren't typical like the little Space Invaders, the little Galaxians. They were gigantic. And on an Apple II, that was difficult to do because it took a lot of CPU power to actually put a graphic on the screen. And Mark was also responsible for NBA Jam in 1993, and WrestleMania, and Total Carnage, and Ballers. And, he's been involved in video games, every year since 1980, and now he's kind of moved to Facebook. Bill Budge was one of the two most foundational people in the game industry. If you trace if you talk to any game programmers and you ask them, hey, who is your influence? Who made you want to make games? You'll get somebody's name, and then if you go and ask that person who's your influence, they might tell you someone else. But at some point, they're all going to meet down at two people. They're going to be Bill Budge or another person named Nasser Chiavelli. Those are the two most foundational people that kind of defined the beginning of the game industry and provided people with like the technical, showed that this advanced technology was possible on these 8-bit computers, and got people very excited because of what they did on those computers. It seemed impossible back then. With Bill Budge, the pinball construction set was huge. There wasn't any kind of toy to play with on any computers back then. And when this program came out, first Raster Blaster came out, and that was one of the earliest, graphical pinball machines on a computer. And so people were extremely excited to see that, there's some sort of ball physics going on, hey, we don't need to go to the arcade anymore and play pinball. I can just do it on a computer now. And then Bill took what he had in Raster Blaster and turned it into pinball construction set. And then that was just unbelievable, because then you could just build a pinball machine, and no one had ever really been able to do that before. So that was the beginning of like construction set type programs on computers. And Bill Budge is, he still continues. He kind of continued working on games until about 2 years ago. And he's at Google now, up where we live in Silicon Valley, but he's not doing games over there. He's actually turned into more of a tools programmer since he'd been working in games this whole time. So Nasser Chiavelli is the other person who's super foundational to the game industry. He basically was a company called Serious Software that created a lot of very technical, very fast arcade games. So that back then proved that home computing, was the place where you could also play games. You didn't need to go to the arcade. These computers were fast enough to actually play arcade games. Much like when we created Wolfenstein and Doom, we kind of showed everybody, you don't need a console, you don't need a Nintendo to play games on a computer. So Nasser did it first back then, where he showed, hey, I can make Defender on an Apple II. That's what Gorgon was. And Nasser was, in the Apple II world, a massive influence for everybody. And then what he did was he left Sirius and he started his own company, and he did that for a couple of years. And then what he did, he kind of took some time off and traveled the world, and everyone thought that he was gone from the game industry. But he came back in 1986, and he asked a friend of his, Doug Carlson, the guy who owns ROMERO software, asked him, hey, what should I be doing? I've been out of it for a couple of years now, and I want to get back into making games. And Doug said, hey, there's this Nintendo Entertainment System that's really amazing, and it's taking off, and it's kind of rebirthing the game industry because of the crash of 1983 and 1984. The game industry needed something to kind of come back from, and Nintendo really brought the game industry back. And so Doug Carlson told Nasser, hey, there's this awesome console you should probably be making games for. Don't worry about the Apple II anymore. And there's a really cool company called Square that could probably use you, and it might be doing some really cool stuff. So Doug introduced Nasser to Square, and Nasser decided to move to Japan And Nasser single-handedly wrote Final Fantasy 1, 2, and 3. And that was after being an unbelievable Apple II programmer. And so Nasser created those 3 games with just himself and some artists. And then he wrote Secret of Mana. And Secret of Mana was also really great, a really great game. And after that was in 1993 when that was published, and he kind of got out of the game industry forever at that point. But one of the things that makes Nasser super special is that when Nasser wrote code back then, other programmers, when you type in code, even today, you type in code, and your code goes into a source editor, and you get to save your code out to disk. Back then, Nasser didn't have what was called an assembler back then. You would type in assembly language into a source editor, and you would assemble the code into machine language, into the opcodes that the CPU would execute. So what Nasser did was he went into the monitor, and which is basically where machine language is, where the memory of the computer is at. And he would type in a line of assembly, and it would instantly convert it into machine language. And he did that for his entire game. So there was no source code. He would type in a line of source, and when he hit enter, it turns into machine code, just bytes of data. And he did that for all of his games. So he had to keep everything in his head, and all of his code that turned from letters and numbers into just pure hexadecimal. He kept all of that in his head, and he said that he could only keep like an entire game probably for about 2 weeks in his head before he started to forget. And so that's really difficult to be able to still work, writing a game and just having to remember in memory where parts of your game were and how you wrote it. And that just kind of shows how special Nasser was. He was a really brilliant programmer, and he used to chain smoke and drink coffee all the time while he was coding. So maybe that was how he did it. I don't know. There's another person that I don't think I have a slide here for him, but I'll mention him. His name was Larry Miller, and Larry Miller also wrote games for Serious Software back then. But Larry Miller only wrote like 3 games, I think, total for the Apple II. So Larry was also another brilliant programmer. I don't know how. I think Nasser was the one who kind of was the magnetizing force to bring these crazy brilliant programmers to Serious Software. But Larry Miller was a programmer who he basically came up with the program for a game in his head, and he would dictate it to a secretary. So he would just kind of smoke his pipe, sit back in his chair, and he would say assembly language like load the accumulator with immediate value 10, load the X register from memory location, whatever. And he would just sit there and dictate it, and she would shorthand write it all out on pads of paper, and then he would have her type it in. And one time, like when he delivered his game to the publisher, he didn't do it on the disk. He actually went there to the publishers with the secretary and all the pads of paper. And while he's sitting there talking to all the programmers, she's sitting there typing into an assembler all of the code that she shorthand wrote, and assembles the game and runs it, and it works fine. Except for a bug here and there with some score or whatever, but it's like, in his games were 3D. So he just did that by just dictating code. He had it all in his head. And, after he did those games, he left the game industry and invented an artificial heart. He's a super brilliant guy. And I think he also lives in Silicon Valley in Foster City. But yeah, back then the game industry was full of really, really smart people. But Nasser and Bill Budge kind of provided the most foundational part of the game industry, and everybody kind of came up from there. Even the people that I mentioned before, Dan Gorlin and Mark Dremel, will cite both of Bill Budge and Nasser as their biggest influences. So, because of the Apple II's place in history, the programmers that attracted, the games that resulted from these amazing programmers, they did forge the game industry, and the future of the industry kind of came from these games that were on the Apple II. So, games like Wizardry in 1980, these RPGs that use Dungeons and Dragons rules and ideas, basically created games like Final Fantasy and Chrono Trigger, going all the way up to World of Warcraft. You can see here, maybe it's kind of dark. But World of Warcraft comes from wizardry, and interestingly enough, Chrono Trigger and Final Fantasy and all Japanese RPGs come directly from wizardry. Because wizardry on the Apple II, it was written in Pascal, and it's funny because the Pascal that was written in on the Apple II was written by an Apple II game programmer as well. Pascal on the Apple II was made by a game programmer at a university. His name was Mark Allen. And then wizardry was written using his Pascal, and wizardry got to Japan, because in Japan they had Apple IIs, and people loved wizardry. They thought it was amazing, and they started making RPGs themselves, except with their own style of fighting and combat. They kind of used the phase system and evolved it to another system. So when people talk about JRPGs, they kind of think that was its own separate thing, evolution that happened, but it's not. It came directly from wizardry over to Japan and back to the United States. And with today's MMOs being the highest evolution of wizardry, basically. Beneath Apple Manor is a game that came out before Rogue. Many of you have probably heard of Rogue, which came out in 1980 in universities, and was a randomized dungeon hack and slash using text characters. And on the very top is, it's hard to see, but it was that's Beneath Apple Manor. And the full-on evolution of Beneath Apple Manor turned into Rogue, and turned into a bunch of other games like Dwarf Fortress, being a very extreme text example. But games like Spelunky in the bottom left, a fully randomized game, and then Minecraft being the very best, highest evolution of Beneath Apple Manor in the bottom right. That's really the game that's driving a lot of innovation right now is Minecraft, but it was based off of Beneath Apple Manor on the Apple II from 1978. Castle Wolfenstein, that came out in 1981 from Silas Warner, was basically the first stealth game. And stealth games are kind of their own subgenre of third person or first person, depending on what your viewpoint is. Stealth gaming evolved from Castle Wolfenstein. I don't have a picture of it right here, but it was a game where you had to be quiet and you had to try and get yourself out of the castle. You had to escape the Castle Wolfenstein, which was a Nazi castle, and you're a U.S. Soldier who was in prison there, and you're trying to get out. You'll shoot Nazis if you have to, but really you're trying to just escape and take stuff out of chests and be very quiet and not set off any alarms or get the SS after you. In 1992, me and my company, id Software, created Wolfenstein 3D, which was supposed to be a sequel to Wolfenstein. In fact, there was a sequel to Castle Wolfenstein called, Escape from Castle Wolfenstein. And that game came out a few years after the original Castle Wolfenstein, but we did a sequel to the original one. And I think it might be Wizardry or it might be Wolfenstein, but there's still sequels to Wolfenstein even today being made since 1981. There's also Wizardry in Japan, but I don't know what the lineage of that is right now. But because it was so fun being stealthy in the original Castle Wolfenstein, the stealth genre had evolved to include Splinter Cell and Hitman, which are the games down at the bottom, and other stealth games that people are creating right now. And so they take different paths to stealth, but they all basically started back in 1981 with Castle Wolfenstein. So there's a game called Wildstead. I'm not sure if any of you have heard of it, but it was a very, very violent game. On the Apple II, there's not a picture of it up here, but it directly influenced Mortal Kombat, which was a game that, back when it came out was pretty gory for the audience. And Street Fighter 2 is in the bottom left, and then Tekken is on the right. there's all these fighting games. But Milestone was also one of the earliest fighting games, even before you know, the Data East games and Karate Champ, etc., or Yai R Kung Fu, or any of those things. The Milestone was two guys going at it with axes, cutting off each other's arms and stuff, and there's blood everywhere. And that came out, you know, in 1981 or 82. It was very, very early. And it didn't look like anything that was in the arcade, so it was also innovative for its time. And you know, all the fighting games basically evolved up from Milestone. Oregon Trail, which was a really great educational game from MECC from like 1980. And Oregon Trail lives on in basically all of the edutainment that we have today. It was one of the first educational games to teach, but also be really fun to play. It wasn't just a, you know, it wasn't just a rote, you know, add these numbers, do some math. It was like, how do you survive in the frontier, which is, it's like a math word problem. How do you take this problem and break it down and fix it? And so Oregon Trail, you know, was kind of the forerunner of all the really great kids games that we have, like Pajama Stand and Putt Putt, and on all these other games. And Oregon Trail actually still survives on the Apple II, or on the iPhone. If you want to download Oregon Trail, you can do it right now on your iPhone, and it's a really amazing version of the original game. It's hilarious. But you know, Oregon Trail is one of the very earliest and best games in education. There's also, I think, Where in the World is Carmen Sandiego also is in here. And that was also a very early game. It was influential, but Oregon Trail came out before it. But have you all heard of Where in the World is Carmen Sandiego? Any of you? So you might not know this, but the game idea was stolen from another company back in the Apple II days. So that was due to one company that needed to get bought because they were running out of money, and then Vertigo basically goes and to see what this company's doing, and they see this awesome game idea that they have, and decides not to buy the company and just make this game themselves. So Where in the World is Carmen Sandiego was actually taken from that company. There's a lot of stories like that in the industry, so don't be too surprised. So Sundog: The Frozen Legacy, probably haven't heard of it, but it was one of the very first open world games like GTA, Grand Theft Auto. So you see Saints Row and GTA, and there's a game called Watch Dogs down the bottom right that's coming out. And they're all open world games where basically you just run around and do whatever you want with anybody there. And Sundog was basically the very first game on the Apple II to be an open world game. You know, it was very primitive compared to what we have now, which is full 3D. But it was a top-down game, very much like Ultima. But it took place in space. And, you know, it was really, really fun and pretty influential for a lot of people back then. It's another one of those games where, you know, hey, so you made GTA. Where'd you get your influence from? Oh, it's okay. Where'd you get your influence? It goes all the way back down to, yeah, Sundog, it was awesome. So it was another foundational game. Wasteland was a really amazing RPG that was set in a post-apocalyptic time period, and is a foundational game of all post-apocalyptic time games. On here you see Left 4 Dead, Fallout 3, and even Gears of War being post-apocalyptic. They all kind of started with Wasteland being the first one to do that, actually graphically. So my entire career has been defined by the Apple II. That's where I started. The arcades kind of came before that, and I played all of the arcade games. But the creativity that kind of resulted from games being made on the Apple II is really what drove me forward. Seeing the limitless possibilities of how fast you could actually make something and just put it out there. I didn't need to go and kind of create a motherboard, burn ROMs, and try and put it in a machine and get it into a store somewhere. You can just program it and see if it works, and if it does, maybe someone will buy it. Back in the 90s, 1980s, I sold a lot of stuff back then. A lot of my earliest games that were published were type-in programs, which it seems really stupid nowadays, but back then people used to actually type in games from magazines. Like people would sit for hours and type in these things and they wouldn't run because there's an error in typing thousands of lines of code, and it was people were just desperate to play stuff back then, especially if it was free inside of a magazine. And so I did publish several games through that where 3 of us were all Apple II diehards. They had been programming for 10 years. So myself, John Carmack, and Tom Hall, all 3 of us got our start in the Apple II basically around 1980, and had been programming in assembly language for 10 years. And so we were all pretty much experts when we got together and started software. And Adrian, the artist, was an amazing pure artist, and he was starting to learn how to put pixels on a screen when we got him in the group. But because he was such a great artist, he learned very, very quickly and started turning out really amazing artwork for Wolfenstein, basically. So being influenced by the Apple II, Wolfenstein was directly like, hey, why don't we make a Wolfenstein sequel? Which was an Apple II game, of course, let's do that. And coming forward from there, everything that we made at id Software was influenced by what we learned on Apple II. All the tricks, all of the concepts of the way that you write code, the way that you construct programs, a lot of the, having 10 years of game playing and programming behind you, back, for a new decade of making games, really helps to make sure that you're doing something new and you're not just kind of reinventing the past, doing the same exact thing. I remember when I was programming on the Apple, I was doing it as much as I could. It was really difficult to get a lot of time because I was still in school. I was still in high school. First I started programming when I got out of 7th grade, and then every spare minute that I could get on a computer, I tried to program, even if I didn't have a computer at home for about 2 years, so I had to go to stores, go to universities and stuff, and just try and find time. And when I finally got a computer at home, I spent as much time as I possibly could trying to make games on it, and that kind of got me as far as I could go with the limited amount of time I had, because I had to go to school, and at school I'm writing code on notepads instead of listening to class, unfortunately. So I didn't have really great grades. I was writing really great games, I guess. But that kind of, I was trying to write games that were as good or better as what I saw out there, like Karateka and Low Runner, and all these really great professional games where these guys had all day long to program, and I had to go to school. And so I was trying to catch up as much as possible, and I kind of felt like I was 2 years behind the forefront of the industry. And then finally, at the very end of the 80s, the whole 8-bit game industry blew up, and I felt like, wow, I just tried really hard for 10 years. And I couldn't make it because the whole thing blew up, because 8-bit is dead. So, I was probably depressed for a few minutes, and was like, okay, what's next? And so PC was the new computer out that was getting very, very popular for gaming, but it still didn't have anything interesting going on with it. So, basically meeting John Carmack and us getting together and writing games, we immediately started writing some really great stuff, and I got to where I was trying to get back in the 80s, at the head of the industry. Finally, with Wolfenstein, or even with Command & Keen, we made something that no one had seen before because of the technical prowess of the code for scrolling and trying to kind of mimic a Nintendo. That at least for me, that one big lesson for everybody is don't give up hope. There's always something new happening all the time. There's the iPhone, there's all these mobile devices, there's lots of toolkits out there. And for me, it was, there's a PC and there's some hardware in there I need to use. So there's Wolfenstein, basically just talking about some of the games that I made, Doom. Interestingly, Wolfenstein was done in 6 months, and Doom was done in a year, and Quake was done in a year and a half. They done, it's like a 6-month increment. for some reason. You know, the hardest game to get out was Quake. It was definitely very hard. Doom was easier to finish than Wolfenstein. So what I did was, I told a lot of people that were in the Apple II industry, you know, what did the Apple II mean to you back then? You know, what was important about it to you? And so I asked these people, what did it mean to your career? You know, their career was back in the 80s, and it still continues for some of these people today. So I'll read this because it's really hard. It's really hard for you guys to read up here. But I asked Bill Budge, you know, what did the Apple II mean to you? And Bill says, I bought my first Apple II computer when I was a PhD student at the University of California at Berkeley. I wanted to play with graphics and sound, something we couldn't do with computers and mini computers that the university had at that time. I started by just playing with this amazing little machine, the Apple II. I typed in Woz's integer basic breakout game and became quite good at it. Eventually being able to hit the ball with such precision that I could drill a hole through the row of bricks and get the ball into the back row where it would clear out the rest of the blocks without me having to move the paddle. When I got tired of that, I tried to make the game more challenging by altering the code. That led to learning 6502 assembly language to make it faster and learning how to draw in high-res graphics to make the board seem larger. Soon I was hooked, and instead of preparing for my exams, I was devoting all my time to programming games. I never got that PhD, but I'm incredibly grateful that the Apple II was my introduction into the world of microcomputers and games. So interestingly enough, you know, Breakout was the game that was very interesting to him to kind of modify and change. And the funny thing is that Steve Wozniak created the Apple II just so he could make Breakout in BASIC on a computer. It's the only reason why he made the Apple II. He just wanted to make the Breakout game in BASIC that had color and sound and stuff. And the reason why he was so excited about doing that is because Steve Wozniak actually created Breakout at Atari. He's the guy who made that game. In fact, him and Steve Jobs both worked at Atari, and they made Breakout with Woz being the guy who actually created the game itself. And then he decided if you want to make a computer, that you could actually make that game in BASIC. And that's why the whole computer industry is here, basically. So Breakout was an important game. John Van Canegum is the guy who created the Might and Magic series, you know, Heroes, Might and Magic, and all those games. He says, the Apple II changed my life. I first discovered this fantastic piece of technology while studying to be a doctor at UCLA. See how smart these guys are, they're all trying to be doctors. Immediately I was hooked. Playing games and learning how to program became my addiction. I decided to switch directions to computer science and convinced myself that I could create games for a living. This amazing machine was my canvas and paint, allowed me to express myself in ways I could never have imagined. To this day, I think about new game designs and ways to use devices that allow people to be creative and have fun, and it all started on my Apple II. Will Wright, who created SimCity and The Sims and Spore and all these games. You might not know this, but Will Wright's first game was called Raid on Bugling Bay, which was a Commodore 64 game. But he actually wrote that game on the Apple II for the Commodore 64 because the Commodore 64 had such an awful keyboard to type on. He didn't want to type on that keyboard, but it was a great game machine. So he wrote Raid on Bugling Bay on an Apple II and just transferred the code over to the Commodore at the end. So he did cross-development of his first game, but he was an Apple II programmer before he ever did his first game. And you might not know that Will Wright actually was an assembly language programmer, because everywhere that you read about Will, it's like he's this game design guy, which he is, but he's also an assembly language programmer. So Will Wright says, I got my first computer, an Apple II Plus, in 1980. I was building robotic contraptions at the time, and a friend talked me into it. I had taken some programming in college, key punch cards and Fortran 77, and found it mildly interesting. But now in front of me, I had a complete computer that I could program and get instant feedback on a graphic display. Back then it was teletypes, you would type something in the computer, which was kind of a typewriter, and it would print out on paper the display. As at universities. Within weeks, I was hooked on it. I dropped all my robotic projects and immersed myself in learning this amazing machine. Within a few months, I was researching AI, simulations, and all sorts of other stuff. As a kid, I loved building models of things, planes, tanks, and ships, and that's what led to my interest in robotics. But now I realize that in this Apple II, I found the ultimate modeling medium, one in which I could finally build dynamic and interactive models of the world. So, that was a little write-up on Apple II. Jordan Mechner, who wrote Karateka and the whole Prince of Persia series. Jordan says, I was a sophomore in high school when I bought my first Apple II. It had a $16K and it cost $1,200, which was my life savings. I remember opening the box, the tactile thrill of lifting the computer out of those custom molded foam packing pieces. I knew it was going to change my life, and it did. For the first time, I had a computer at home that was all mine. Not only could I play games on it as much as I wanted, I could program whenever I wanted. After school and instead of school, I progressed from typing in program listings from the Redbook to inventing my own games. Over the next 5 years, I wrote dozens of games, all unpublished, until in 1984, my dream came true. My game, Karateka, was accepted for publication by ROMERO Software. And what had been my passion and hobby became my career. In all, I spent 10 years programming Apple II before Prince of Persia shipped in 1989, and I finally moved on to more powerful development systems. I've never felt the same sentimental attachment to any of them. Jordan Mechner, he actually kept a lot of notes on how he created Karateka. So he has entire journals full of his exercise routines and how many hours he spent programming that day, in which classes he skipped that day. So he wouldn't repeat those classes being skipped in sequential order. So he was spending as much time as he could doing that. And so he's got all of this. It was great. He documented the entire development of Karateka. He put down to drawing all the characters on paper and everything like that. So Richard Garriott created Origin Systems in the Ultima series. Richard says, the importance of the Apple II in my early career was that a machine with the perfect level of complexity for one person to wholly master. In my case, this allowed me to know every byte of memory, every I/O port, how to modulate a 1-bit speaker to make sawtooth sound forms, gave rise to deep understanding of binary hex and each and every command within the processor, every byte of a ROM, every subroutine of DOS. The result of this is that it gave me a wide-ranging understanding of the technical trade-offs between design goals, art needs, audio needs, text storage, frame rate, and each and every discipline that makes a game work. Few today get such a wide-ranging level of expertise as the base is so complex that specialization begins early in one's career now. The result is that while every artist I've ever hired is better than I ever was, and while I was a decent programmer, again, I've been pummeled by the technical skills of those who have come since. An area of design and production where someone has to make the judgment call as to which specialty will gain favor over the machine's limited resources. I have an intuitive understanding that helps guide my decisions, and I still feel that my design skills rank at the top of the heap. Not because I'm innately more creative, but because of the journey I've been on, starting with the Apple II. Thanks, Steve and Steve. Soft Talk, I didn't get a picture here, but Soft Talk was the foundational magazine back then. Everybody has to read magazines about their favorite computers and games and stuff, and back then, there were several magazines out that talked about Apple IIs, and Byte Magazine was one big one, Creative Computing was another one, but they kind of did specialize in the Apple II, and Soft Talk Magazine was the very best magazine out really for any kind of computer, because it took a very humanistic approach to computing. It wasn't just, there's a lot of technical jargon for programmers out there. It was just written by people who really didn't even know how to program. But they did get people to write for the magazine that knew programming, but they just got a column or two. But they talked, they had stories in there, and they talked about normal things like the Super Bowl and betting on who would win, and just basic stuff like that. So it felt like you're part of a family. And the Apple the Apple II community called this magazine the glue that held the whole community together. So it was a very important publication. Soft Talk was only out from 1980 to 1984, but that was a very important time period. And they're one of the only magazines out there that documented the top games in different categories, also the top 30 selling programs, in the industry back then. So those are very valuable pieces of data even now, because that stuff wasn't documented back then except for this magazine. So I talked to the people who wrote it. There were two people, and Margot Comstock and Al Tomervig, and they basically told me this about the Apple II. The Apple II we bought in 1979 came with a handful of cassette tapes. The store in Burbank, one of 3 computer stores in all of Los Angeles, expected their first disk drives to appear in a couple of weeks. Yeah, I was using cassette tapes back then. When they arrived on time, we moved from Brick Out, which was the game that Steve Wozniak wrote on the Apple II. We moved from Brick Out, it's called Little Brick Out, to the wonder of Beneath Apple Manor, which is the first road game. A true dungeon adventure game. Wilderness Campaign wasn't far behind, an adventure involving managing resources. By the time we made Soft Talk magazine, games were abounding. Every month there was some exciting breakthrough. Colorful low-res blocks gave way to black and white high-res cows and dungeons. Text adventures gained vocabulary and greater interaction. Ken Williams created the high-res, white-line drawn pictures on black screen adventure Mystery House. And a few months later, figured out how to fill in the color, and color high-res was born. Serious Software, not too long after, learned how to move through scenery seemingly seamlessly instead of jumping from one scene to another. All of this happened with no change in the hardware. At some point, a card came out that could up your 48K Apple to 64K, but that was it. Everything else was software. And the absolute leaders in software progress were gamers. Productivity software, educational software, word processors, accounting programs, all that serious stuff, learned slowly and sometimes reluctantly from the game makers. Games were the leaders of progress, and the games were more amazing with every turn. Another advance, perhaps even more amazing and important, was what some of these games brought out in the folks who played them. Consider the very early sophisticated wizardry. The playing field consisted of numerous levels of a dungeon made of high-res white lines on black. At the bottom of the screen were the names of your 6 characters whom you never saw. Yet players became adept at sweeping through these large, complex, visually nearly featureless dungeons swiftly and confidently, even to the point of being able to discuss dungeon trips with other players. And everyone understood. A few years later, another breakthrough game from Mike Berlin and Infocom, Suspended, provided the ability to have 6 characters who would travel not in a group but independently, so the player could have his characters accomplish different tasks virtually simultaneously. And on it went in a fantastic avalanche of joyful wonder for years. A time of wonder that has not been repeated, but that colors and enhances everything we enjoy on our Macs and iPads and iPhones today. This was the beginning of electronic arts. Bill Budge, Danny Berry, Les Wall, John Freeman, David Maynard, the other guys. Those were the foundational guys of the game issues there. Thanks for listening to me.
Hola, señor Romero. This being an academic congress, so I have to ask a technical question. In your experience programming games, what has been like the hardest hurdle you'd have to jump in programming-wise, and what has been your best hit technically, not maybe sales-wise, but technically.
Okay, programming-wise, it's kind of funny. I'd say one of the most difficult things that I've written in my programming career was probably this code that I had to write in assembly, 6502 assembly language, that converted graphics from the Apple II to the Commodore 64 when I was doing the port of Might Magic 2. Because of the graphic displays on the two machines, they're very, very different. And on the Apple II, we used New World Computing used a double high-res screen mode that had 16 color pixels, like EGA mode on a PC. On the Commodore 64, to make that same picture look good on the Commodore 64, I had to use what was called multicolor mode. And in multicolor mode on the Commodore 64, the limitation on that was that 4 pixels across by 8 pixels down could only have 4 colors in that little block. And one of those colors had to be a color that was shared with the entire screen. So usually that was black. Usually you would basically set a register value, and you would set it to white or black or something. And that was basically bits. There were 2 bits that were, if they were 0, 0, they would use this one register. If they were 0, 1, they would use the low nibble of a byte in memory to choose the color for the 0, 1 pattern, and then a 1, 0 pattern would be the high nibble of the byte, and then the 1, 1 pattern would come from the low nibble of another byte somewhere else in memory. And so it was a really messed up graphic mode on the Commodore 64, and I had to write this algorithm in assembly that would convert a 16, I could have 16 colors anywhere in this image, but I needed to convert it into an image that looked as close to that original image as possible, but in this messed up graphic format, which had to do a lot of color counting and keeping track of colors I'd used before between different boxes, because all the boxes had to be put together to form the image instead of just a nice pure bitmap. And doing that in assembly was even more complex. Not only was the algorithm complex, the data organization was complex, and doing it in assembly and stuff. So I'd have to say that was probably one of the craziest pieces of code. It was really fun to write, but that was a pretty, and of course, nobody ever got to see that code. It was a pre-processed code, but they got to see Might Magic, look really good on the Commodore. But it was because of that code that it looked good, because every scene was a big, huge color scene, and it was converted by this code for every single one of those scenes. And there really wasn't any touching up of those images after they were generated. So that was kind of difficult.
Hello. In your opinion, what is your best achievement in your programming career?
I'd have to say Doom, probably. That game was done in a really great time period. It just took a year. It was, I think at the time it was very exciting to make that game, because I'm not sure if you guys know this, but we did not write Doom on the PC. We wrote it on the Next Step operating system on these desktops or these workstations. So we used a different operating system and a different computer than the one that was actually put on it. It's called cross-development. So when we were writing the code for Doom, Doom took place in DOS on a 320 by 200 pixel VGA screen. But when we wrote the game, we wrote it on these 1024 by 768 workstations, and we could see our code and our game running in a little bitty 320 by 200 pixel window on the screen. And we could set breakpoints, we could do everything, on Next Step. So we could run the game, put breakpoints in there, and all this stuff. We didn't have to use Turbo Debugger or get multiple monitors like you would have to do on the DOS. And so on Next Step, we actually had a superior operating system that let us make a really great game. And because of the superiority of the operating system, we weren't kind of limited in developing it. It was a really great environment. We even had a compiler on Next Step that would compile it into Intel code. And the Next Step machine that we were on was like, it used a 68,000 processor, which means that if you guys know what endianness is, the endianness of the bytes of data was reversed from the way Intel stores it. So we had to even have endian routines swap the endianness of our data before it stored it for DOS. So we had endian functions all over the place to do this stuff. But it was a much better development environment. We could iterate extremely fast, lots of breakpoints, lots of it wasn't the fastest thing drawing on the screen there, but it allowed us to make the game pretty quickly and basically save the code to a drive, a network drive that we then on DOS would just basically run it right off the network drive after it had already been compiled in Next Step for Intel. The Next Step operating system could compile for many different processor architectures, PowerPCs and Intels, and Motorola's and everything. It was really an amazing operating system, which became the foundation of OS X, which is what Macs use and iPhones use. So that was all for the Next Step, and that was, we started using those in 1992. Actually, in 1991. But, we've been using this for a long time. So now everybody's using OS X, and they're using iOS, and that all came from actually back in the 80s, in 87 is when that stuff was invented.
Hello. What is the thing you're looking forward to most right now in the gaming industry?
What am I looking forward to most? In the game industry. I guess I'm looking forward to seeing what's going to happen with the social part of games. Social mobile is where I think social is going to kind of be more popular than social on Facebook. I think people are tired of the fast follow mentality of Facebook, where you would make a game using certain mechanics, and then someone else, 10 other people would copy those mechanics. And the people that these games are made for at home see it and they get bored because they see the same game 10, 20 times. So they kind of stop playing those games. But the iPhone ecosystem is not such a fast follow mentality. So I'm excited to see where mobile gaming is going and kind of taking the social element. I'm also excited about independent games. If you guys have not heard of it, Indiecade is a really amazing independent game conference that takes place every year in Culver City. And the thing I like about it is it's not like GDC, where you have thousands and thousands of people that work in the game industry in some form that are all part of teams that are, some teams are made up of hundreds of people. And so everybody is almost like a cog in a big machine. When you go to Indiecade, each person you meet probably made an entire game by themselves. And that's very, very exciting. And their game designs are unconstrained by companies because they do it at home, so they're very innovative, very inventive. So that's the most exciting stuff for me, is to see where these indie game designers are going with their concepts. Because sometimes those game concepts will wind up in big games. But more interestingly is how do they use the iPhone or the iPad to do something really interesting and imaginative. There's a game that a lot of people are playing right now called Super Hexagon. I don't know if you guys have heard of it, but it's made by a great programmer who just pumps out games over and over and over. Terry Kavanaugh is his name. And Super Hexagon is a very hard game to play on your iPhone, but it's extremely addictive. And it kind of goes back to the old arcade games of the early 80s, where you could get into a zone where you don't even have to think anymore, and you start getting really, really good at the game. And it's really hard to make games where you have to get into a zone to actually excel at it. but this game, Super Hexagon, is a very simple name, but it's a really amazing game. You should try it out.
Hello. And what do you think about the game industry moving into Linux?
I think it's awesome. I mean, you know, I really respect Valve a lot. In fact, I helped Valve start up back in 1996. Michael Abrash was working at id Software. He was friends with Mike Harrington and Gabe Newell, who were new Microsoft millionaires that they had just left Microsoft. And they wanted to start a game company and they needed advice. So Mike Abrash said, hey, come over to id Software. You know, John will tell you what you need to know. So they came over to id and they licensed the Quake engine and they told them how they should start up the company and how they should, kind of construct their team. And so that's where they kind of started doing Half-Life. And he also had the idea for Steam, which is also very important. And it started, on DOS and then Windows, and then basically he goes out to OS X, which I thought was a great move to make Steam games, run. If you have an OS X version, you just pay once you get as many platforms as that game is on. And with the recent news of just how bad Windows 8 is for developers, the move to Linux is just like a slap in the face to Microsoft, but Linux has been there for a long time, and Linux is used for servers for every game that's out there, like any MMO. It's very rare to find any kind of online game that uses Windows as the server. It's mostly all Linux and like lab stack, a whole lab stack setup. So the back end is Linux. Why won't the front end be Linux as well? And with Ubuntu being the most I guess, consumer-friendly version of Linux out there, I can see when games move into Linux in a big way via Valve's push through Steam. I can see Ubuntu becoming way more of a challenge to Windows, and with developers leaving Windows. We'll see what happens.
In your opinion, is the free-to-play system really successful, like in World of Warcraft? The free-to-play, like you play for free, or there's some things that you can buy in the game.
Yeah.
So,
what do you want to know about free-to-play?
Is it really worth it? Like,
oh, do you think is a viable viable business strategy?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I super believe that free to play is like the ultimate evolution of shareware. It's the most fair way for anybody to experience a game, and if they like it, they decide to pay for it instead of I just spent $60. Like even back in the day, I just spent $30. And you play the game and it's like, oh my God, I hate this thing. And I just spent $30. So how do I, like when we started making our games in shareware, that really changed the industry because now we're giving away entire games for free. Meanwhile, LucasArts and all these other companies don't even have demos available. So we have entire games available if you like it. Buy the next chunk of games. So then everyone was forced to make demos back in the early 90s. Because we were giving away the best game that anyone had played was free, and so after that point, demos were the norm, and still you're getting to play a little bit of something and then pay for a big huge chunk, and look at a game like World of Warcraft, you can download it for free and play it for a while, and decide to subscribe, install the subscription model. You can still get a lot of play time to see if you like it. So it feels very fair that when you sign up for World of Warcraft, you actually do know that you like the game and you do want to spend that money. Whether it's subscription or free to play at that point is kind of irrelevant. But free to play is basically similar in that you can play the game as much as you want. You don't need to pay for stuff. It's just how do they try and monetize free to play is where people can get bad rep or not. If you are trying to monetize if there's the only way that you can get something through a free-to-play game is to spend money on it, people don't like that so much. If you have a pure time versus time equals money model where you can get everything in a free-to-play game, people feel like that's way more fair, and at some point they will probably pay. And there's even more monetization strategies that are being invented for free-to-play that people haven't implemented yet. But even that monetization model continues to evolve in the way that free-to-play monetization is implemented. So the way that it's implemented is the evolution of that model. It's a very valid model still, and I know that it makes it really tough to create big AAA games that cost tens of millions of dollars, because the publishers feel like they need to get the money as fast as they can by charging $60 for a brand new game. But in the long run, I believe that free-to-play will make them way more money than that $60. If you want to compare like my World of Warcraft playing to how much money somebody spent on a game, I've spent thousands of dollars on World of Warcraft because I bought so much gold. I spent so much money on gold. If I could just pay them money for gold inside the game, I don't care where I'm getting the gold. I just want to pay for it. I want to get ahead in the game and get up to max levels fast, because at max level of World of Warcraft, money really doesn't help so much except for just like decorative stuff. You actually have to earn it. So the highest level players feel like they're not being, bought out of the game by people that have money. It's like at some level you have to have time, and money means nothing. So World of Warcraft has provided a lot of great design for free-to-play games, and I think players feel like someone's not basically paying to win the game, but they're paying their way up to a certain level that gets them at the beginning of the hardest part of the game, which is the end game. So, so free-to-play, I'm totally in favor of free-to-play. I think it's great. Facebook games have to live on it. It takes a lot of inventive design to do free-to-play correctly. I also am not a fan of virals popping up in your face all the time. I don't think that's a good free-to-play strategy. But I do like the fact that I might be able to spend $5 here and there for certain things in the game. Maybe they're consumables, or maybe it's some in-game currency. And at some point, the amount of little bits of money that I've spent have equaled that $60 that they were hoping to get at once from at the very beginning. I think games will make more money with free-to-play than just $60 at a time.
We will give you a gift from the organizers.
Thank you. Gifts on stage. I needed to bring this back for our wedding reception.
And also here's the diploma that reads the Universidad Autónoma de Baja California, Facultad de Ciencias Administrativas y Sociales, otorgan el presente agradecimiento a John Romero por haber impartido la conferencia magistral El impacto de Apple II en los videojuegos, en el marco del 5º Congreso Internacional en Ciencias Computacionales CiComp, celebrado del 31 de octubre al 2 de noviembre del 2012 en Senado, Baja California. Firman el doctor Juan Crisóstomo Tapio Mercado y la doctora Mónica Lacabex de ROMERO.
I think this might be the first diploma I got since high school. Thanks a lot, everybody. This is great. I think this might have been the first iPad presentation as well. The whole thing was done on an iPad. At GDC, I did the presentation all from my iPhone. And it was the first time they'd done that.
amigos y continuamos con Brenda.